To create a compost bin by using an unused container, start by selecting a container made of durable materials such as plastic or a barrel that's large enough for your composting needs. The first step is to drill one hole in the bottom of the container for water drainage. This hole should be large enough to allow water to drain freely, but small enough to prevent solid compost from escaping. After drilling the hole, use rubber material around the hole to create a seal and prevent leakage. You can apply silicone sealant or use rubber washers or grommets to secure it in place, ensuring that the water does not leak out of the bottom. Next, you'll need to connect the necessary equipment for water drainage. For example, you can attach a PVC pipe to the hole in the container to direct the drained water to another location, such as a drainage pit or your garden. If desired, you can also use plastic tubing to further control and direct the flow of water. Once the drainage system is set up, the next step is to create a separation layer inside the compost bin to ensure that water doesn't mix with the compost material. To do this, cut a piece of plastic filter or perforated plastic sheet that fits the bottom of the container. Drill multiple small holes in the plastic filter to allow water to pass through while keeping the solid compost material separated. Secure the plastic filter inside the container, ensuring that it is placed a few inches above the bottom to allow water to drain through it. The next part involves creating a wooden base layer inside the container to elevate the plastic filter and provide proper airflow. Use wooden pieces to form a small table-like structure inside the compost bin, elevating the filter above the bottom of the container. This wooden base will prevent the compost from sitting in pooled water at the bottom and will allow for better aeration. Once you have assembled your compost bin, it's important to place it in a suitable location to ensure optimal composting conditions. Choose a spot that is well ventilated and receives partial sunlight for most of the day. The sun will help warm up the compost materials, speeding up the decomposition process, but avoid placing it in full direct sunlight, as this can dry out the compost too quickly. The location should also be convenient for adding compostable materials and for draining excess water, so ensure that the drainage pipe or hole can effectively direct water away from the bin. Ideally, place the bin in a flat, level area where the water drainage will not create a mess, and it should be on a solid surface like gravel or soil, which allows proper drainage. Additionally, it's best to keep the bin in a location that's easy to access for turning or mixing the compost and for adding new organic waste. Make sure the compost bin is not placed too far from your garden or yard if you plan to use the finished compost in those areas. With the right placement, your compost bin will function efficiently, and you'll have a steady supply of nutrient-rich compost for your plants. Once your compost bin is in place, it's time to begin adding compostable materials. Start by adding carbon-rich materials, also known as browns, which help balance the nitrogen-rich materials, or greens, in the compost. For the carbon portion, you can use shredded paper, newspapers, cardboard, or paper towels, dried leaves, or straw. These materials provide the necessary structure and airflow to the compost. Begin by layering the bottom of the bin with a few inches of shredded paper or cardboard to provide a good base. After the carbon layer, add a layer of nitrogen-rich materials like green plant matter, kitchen scraps, vegetable peels, coffee grounds, and grass clippings. Following that, sprinkle a handful of soil on top. Soil helps introduce beneficial microorganisms to aid in the decomposition process. Next, add eggshells, which are great for adding calcium to your compost and help balance the acidity. Crush the eggshells into small pieces before adding them to the bin. The key to effective composting is maintaining a balance between carbon and nitrogen, with about 3 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. You can continue adding layers of paper, kitchen scraps, soil, and eggshells as needed, making sure to mix the contents periodically to encourage aeration and faster decomposition. After you've added the initial layers of compostable materials to your bin, it's a great next step to introduce worms, particularly red wigglers, Icenia fetida, into the mix. Red wigglers are known for being some of the best composters, and they thrive in organic matter, breaking it down quickly and efficiently. These worms are ideal for composting because they don't burrow deep into the soil like earthworms, but instead prefer to stay near the surface, where they feed on decaying organic material. Introducing worms to your compost bin will not only speed up the decomposition process, but also result in nutrient-rich worm castings, which are considered one of the best natural fertilizers you can add to your garden. Add worms to your compost bin. Start by placing them on top of the compost pile. You don't need to dig them into the compost, as they will naturally burrow down into the layers of organic matter over time. Just release them gently and let them do their work. You don't need a huge amount of worms. Typically, a handful of red wigglers is enough to get them started. The more worms you have, the quicker your compost will break down, but even a small number of worms can make a big difference in the speed of the process. Before adding worms, make sure that the environment in the compost bin is suitable for them to thrive. Worms prefer a moist environment, but not one that is too wet. The compost should be about as damp as a wrung-out sponge, not too soggy. If the compost becomes too dry, the worms will struggle to thrive, and if it's too wet, they may drown. You can add moisture by lightly watering the compost with a hose or a watering can, but it's important not to overdo it. If the compost becomes too wet, you may want to add additional dry materials like shredded paper, cardboard, or dry leaves to help balance the moisture level. The compost bin should also be kept well aerated. Worms need oxygen to survive, so ensure that the bin has adequate ventilation. If you've drilled holes in the lid or sides for airflow, this will help provide the oxygen the worms need. Additionally, make sure that the materials in the bin aren't too compacted, as this can reduce airflow and create an unhealthy environment for the worms. You can periodically mix or turn the compost to maintain good aeration and to encourage the worms to work through the different layers of organic matter. One thing to keep in mind is that worms are sensitive to acidic materials. So, it's best to avoid adding too many citrus fruits, onions, or spicy foods to the compost bin. These can make the environment too acidic for the worms and may harm them. Instead, focus on adding a mix of carbon-rich materials like shredded paper, cardboard, straw, and dried leaves, and nitrogen-rich materials like fruit and vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, and grass clippings. This will help keep the balance of the compost just right for the worms. It's also important to give the worms time to adjust to the new environment. They might initially stay near the surface, but as they get accustomed to their new home, they will gradually burrow deeper into the compost pile. Over time, the worms will create worm castings, which are incredibly rich in nutrients and beneficial microorganisms that will help fertilize your plants. You'll start to notice that the compost begins to break down more quickly, turning into dark, rich, crumbly material. This is a sign that the worms are doing their job effectively. As the compost continues to break down, you can keep adding more organic material to feed the worms. It's important to monitor the bin regularly to make sure the worms are healthy and active. If you notice that they seem to be dying off or moving away from certain areas, it might be a sign that the compost is too wet, too dry, or too acidic. When it comes time to harvest your compost, you can either sift out the worm castings and separate them from the remaining compost, or you can gently shake the bin to one side, letting the worms move to the other side, and then remove the finished compost. Be sure to leave a small portion of the compost and worms in the bin to continue the process. By adding worms to your compost bin, you're not just speeding up the composting process, you're also creating a healthier, more fertile environment for your garden. The worm castings will enrich the soil with essential nutrients, improving plant growth, water retention, and overall soil health. With the right balance of moisture, aeration, and care, your compost bin with worms will transform your organic waste into valuable compost in no time.